Welcome to Forum 360 for a Zoom edition of our Global Outlook with a Local View. I'm Leslie Ungar, your host today. I believe there are a million bad things that COVID is responsible for, but there are also a few good things. Due to COVID, Forum 360 has the ability to do Zoom, and our guest today is a guest that we would never be able to have if it wasn't for the ability to Zoom. Mark Halperin is a national figure, former ABC News, Bloomberg, Showtime, a best-selling author, contributor, and a writer of a newsletter 7 days a week. Anyone that has ever written a newsletter knows that 7 days a week is quite an accomplishment. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest visiting Forum 360 today, a weekly guest on Sirius Radio, but our guest today. Welcome, Mark.
Leslie, thank you. I'm pretty sure if you'd asked me to drive to Ohio pre-COVID, I would have. So I'm challenging your initial premise, but very nice of you to invite me, and very glad I could join you.
I confess that I'm a political junkie, and I have come to the conclusion that embalming fluid may be the only cure. But I've also come to realize over the years that not everyone is interested in politics. Perhaps the last 4 years have changed that a little bit. We'll find out today. While I have as my guest today is an expert, whatever that means in today's national politics, my goal today is for all of us to learn some lessons from politics and from everyday life that we can apply to our professional life. So welcome, viewers and listeners. My guest and I have never met before. I once emailed him last fall to ask if he wanted my unsolicited advice about something, which he said he did. And that's the only contact we had until a few weeks ago. I assumed my place on the couch at about 8:04 p.m. And I emailed Mark and asked him to be a guest on Forum 360. At 8:12, he answered me yes. Now, I want to start out with this question, Mark, because as an executive coach, I counsel clients to be responsive to emails. It's a way to protect your value. But you have to get emails from all over the country, if not the world. First of all, I have to ask you, how do you answer everyone's email?
It takes a lot of time, but I think it's important to do. One great thing about doing a newsletter with readers, mostly in the United States, but some all over the world, is I get to hear from lots of people. And particularly during COVID, when the basics of being a reporter, at least as far as I've been a reporter, which is traveling around and talking to people, it's just not been possible very much. The chance to hear from people, you can learn a lot from questions. Sometimes people will email me with advice or information. A lot of my readers are people who are sources of mine who send me information, but just getting questions from readers is a great gift as far as I'm concerned professionally. And during the pandemic, it allows me to stay in touch with real people, which is nice. And so I've always believed that if you let your inbox grow too big, you'll never get it back down. I had a little crisis late last year where mine grew to a very large number, and I spent 6 months getting it down. It's now almost manageable. So I try to answer very quickly, and I'm a pretty fast Googler. So I got your request and I Googled about the program and about you, and seemed like a good opportunity to get a chance to talk to you and to others. So I'm happy to do it, and happy to, as I always am, to engage with people who are interested in the world.
So that was my next question, was why? Because I'm thinking if you said yes to me, that means that you're pretty open. So what lesson is there, I guess, out there for people to say yes to opportunities that, maybe unexpected and you can't really know for sure?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't recommend people say yes to everything. And I have a general rule about radio and television, which is I never go on a program I haven't seen or listened to. So I did a little quick viewing to see. But if time allows and someone is, the way you asked was very gracious, and you explained the program, you explained why you were asking. And so I think that time management in the digital age is extremely challenging, no matter who you are. I wonder how, super important, super busy people manage their inboxes, because it's a challenge. But, you're somebody like, Ron Klain, the White House chief of staff, or Jared Kushner, who worked for his father-in-law in the White House, they must get lots and lots of texts and emails, and it's a big challenge to manage. But I think it's important to be responsive to people, and I think it's important to look for opportunities to do interesting things. And I consider this being on here with you, Leslie, to be an interesting thing.
Thank you. Like 2020 taught us that in our professional lives, that we had to learn to be nimble. My words for 2020 were to be brand, to be energized, to be resilient. In your career, you've been a producer, an author, a journalist, a Showtime, a contributor, a host. What is some advice that you have about recreating your professional self?
Well, I think, I'm just coming back from the first sort of extensive reporting trip I've done in a year to CPAC in Florida. And I was reminded of something I call the producer gene. Television producers are, who are good television producers, have the ability to get things done and the mentality that they're going to get something done. So you walk into a hotel and you need 10 rooms because you got a big family trip, and they say, "Oh, we lost your reservation. There are no rooms," and everybody's tired and wants to go to sleep. Someone with the producer gene has everybody in bed within 20 minutes. They just do. And so whether I've been a host or an anchor or a reporter or a writer or a producer, once I developed that producer gene pretty early in my career, I go into any situation confident that I can get us those 10 rooms. And I think that applies to almost any career, because I have friends who do lots of different things, whether you're a lawyer, an accountant, a bus driver, a farmer. Having that producer gene, which is, again, just the mentality that says, I will get this done and I will do it nicely. I'm not going to steamroll people or yell at people or trick people. I will be nice. I will be firm. I will be creative, and I will get things done. And so throughout my career, whenever I've done something new, I've employed that producer gene.
Now, in one of your newsletters, you talked about something that I had not heard talked about in probably decades, way before cell phones. When I was first starting out, I was in sales. I was taught if you wanted to get a hold of the owner of the company, either call early in the day or call late in the day. Right. And you were talking about how you would spoke to someone very new in the position in the Biden administration, that you would simply called early. So sometimes there's advice that stays consistent, but do you remember that story and what someone could glean from that?
I do, although I have to say it was not a true story in that case. It's something I've done throughout my career, but in that case, it was a little joke. There's nothing wrong with calling the president's national security advisor at six in the morning, knowing that if he's there, he's probably going to pick up his own phone. If he doesn't want to pick up the phone, he doesn't have to. If he picks up, he doesn't want to talk, he can excuse himself. But in general, again, that's the producer gene. That's creative. I want to talk to that person. If I tried to call him at 10 o'clock, one thing I'll say, as a professional matter for reporters, professional matters for others, and as a personal matter, I'm a big fan of the voice as opposed to texting and email. I do a lot of texting and email and communicating on social media, but I think one thing I tell young reporters is pick up the phone and call, and when we're not in a pandemic, go see people face to face. Young people, I find, just it's not their default. Their default is digital, text communication or sending emojis or photos. So I call people a lot, and I find that to be more human and more helpful. And again, I'll go back to the producer gene of just saying, you're going to solve the problem. You're not going to admire the problem, bemoan the problem, describe it, examine it, tell other people about it. You're just going to solve it.
Now, you, when I Googled you, your father was a foreign policy expert. Now, I'm
still
curious,
is.
Still is. I live with a man who grew up in another country, and that has affected how I look at both America and how the world looks at America. And I'm wondering if there was something that you can point to that contributed to your view of either America or how the world looks at America.
What country?
Tunisia, France, Israel, America.
That's a lot of countries.
Mhm.
My father worked in the Lyndon Johnson Pentagon, and then in the Nixon White House. And he traveled quite a bit for work and dealt with a lot of global issues, and had a particular focus for a time on Japan. And Japan has been one of my great personal and professional interests as well. I've been there a lot, and I'm very interested in their culture. And that prism, I could give you a lot of answers to the question, but this is what I'm giving you. That prism has been incredibly helpful to me, because Japan, during my lifetime, most of my lifetime in my adult life, has been one of the leading industrialized democracies in the world, and a vibrant economy, vibrant democracy, a leader internationally on things the United States has been a leader in culture and technology, in architecture, and yet it couldn't be more different than the United States in a lot of ways. So when I studied Japan in college, their governmental system is very different than the United States, very different. They have a parliamentary system. But what I quickly learned, thanks to one of my professors, is their system politically is actually more like the other industrialized democracies in the US. So Japan has been a great prism for me to see the way the United States is atypical in some ways, more typical in others, and to have a country like Japan whose economy and cultural influence is so similar and yet is in so many ways different, has been a real benefit to me to kind of keep my perspective about the US's place in the world.
Now, before we get to the current day, you
Mhm.
went to Harvard. What is something that would surprise us about going to Harvard?
Um, I don't know, because people are pretty knowledgeable about everything these days. So whenever I'm asked what would surprise, I always hesitate. I think it's the case, at least when I was there, that if you go there and you don't want to be a very academic person, you don't have to be a very academic person, and you can still graduate. Um, I'm a very bad student. I get sleepy when I read, and I'm not very disciplined, and I'm not great at taking tests. So
And
although I
you
think I
still
could do better
graduate.
now. I still graduated. So my point is,
Okay.
there's some places where it's some competitive schools where I think there's more pressure to be academically oriented once you get in. There really isn't at Harvard. Once you're in, it's kind of like, I wouldn't say easy, but you can make it relatively easy academically. And that's the way a lot of elite Japanese universities are. It's hard to get into elite Japanese university, but once you get in, my understanding is you don't have to work all that hard as compared to getting in, and the process to get in, and that's what Harvard can be like if that's what one chooses.
Now, that is a surprise.
Okay, there you go.
Now, this show will air in a few weeks, but I'm asking this question because this past weekend may have repercussions for the next 2 or 4 years. You were
Mhm.
just at CPAC.
Mhm.
You have written about being at CPAC when Trump first spoke to CPAC, and how you felt about seeing him first speak, and the effect that he may have in the future. So my
Mhm.
first question is, did you hear anyone at CPAC that you felt is going to have a big effect in the next 2 to 4 years?
Um, yeah, I mean, I could name a lot of people because I listen to a lot of people. I talk to a lot of people there, but the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, and someone who I've talked to in the past, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. I think all three of them have the potential to be the Republican nominee in 2024, and to be big players in at least within the conservative movement and the Republican Party, if not more broadly. But I'd say those three are three people I talked to who I would definitely keep your eye on.
When I watch journalists now on TV,
Mm-hmm.
I think of, say, Maggie Haberman. I wonder, when you were a journalist, did you think you were going to be making a living, or partly making a living, on a visual medium like TV, or did you see yourself just as a print journalist that would just be doing the writing but wouldn't be out front?
Well, my first job was in television, and most of my career I've been in television. I was at Time Magazine for a while, but even when I was at Time, I did a lot of television. I didn't start doing on-air work until a little bit when I was covering Bill Clinton in 1991, and then let's see, by 2000, I was doing a lot of on-air work. So 12 years into my career, I shifted to a role that was kind of 50-50 on air and behind the scenes. And then in around 2008, I shifted to primarily being, having a byline in Time Magazine, and being in front of the camera. So I've never given up though being a producer, and I think one piece of
That
advice,
producer gene.
yeah, the producer gene, and one piece of advice I give people who work in anything that's collaborative, and most jobs are, most civic activities, volunteer work is try to figure out how everyone else does their job. What's hard about their job? What's fun about their job? How did they learn to do their job? Because the more you understand what other people are doing, the easier it is to appreciate their work, and the easier it is to get the most out of the collaborative effort. You know, put a taped piece of television on the air, um, you know, on a network is, you know, 150 people literally could touch that in one way or the other, from the graphics to the bookings to the editing to the shooting. If you know a lot about how everybody works, you can get the most out of it. You can minimize the dangers and the risks, and you can maximize the creative opportunities. So even as I've become, even as I became someone who was on camera hosting shows, I thought a lot about, oh, how do they make that graphic? How do they get that piece of video? Who's booking the satellite time? All of those things. I think if I've had one advantage or two advantages, of the two advantages I think that have allowed me to have some success in my career, one of the two is I've always appreciated and learned about how other people do their jobs. And like I said, I think that's applicable to almost any other profession.
Yes, I think that it is. Now, before we turn to today's politics, I want to reintroduce our guest today, Mark Halperin. He is currently author of the 7-Day Week Wide World of News and contributed to other sources on today's politics. So first, let me ask you this. I hear educated people say all the time, I don't watch the news, I don't watch any of the politics, I don't turn on the TV, I don't read anything. Why should the quote average, there is such a thing, average American care about the daily goings on in our capital?
Well, you know, you've talked about politics now, using that phrase a couple times. I think that for me, politics is not who's someone hiring as their campaign manager or when's this committee going to pass this bill. To me, politics is the aspirations of the country. What, in case of America, what are the aspirations of the American people? And in both politics and government, if they're being done correctly and if they're being covered by journalists correctly, it's that's the prism through which to look to that. So there are lots of people who care about who's Joe Biden's campaign manager going to be, or who's his Secretary of Defense going to be. I care about that stuff some, but not nearly as much as a lot of political reporters. I care about, you know, what does the country want in a defense secretary? What does the country want to spend on the Pentagon? So I think I don't blame people for not being interested in the, you know, the nuts and bolts and kind of the soap opera aspects of it. Some people are, some aren't. But I think what everybody should be interested in is what the government doing, what political candidates are saying, how does that potentially affect the real lives of real people? And if that's how you think of it, if that's how it's covered, then I think who wouldn't be interested in that? Because the government's the biggest part of our economy. It's the biggest expression of our national aspirations, our national hopes and fears, and tells you, you know, can you send your kid to college? Can you afford to buy a house? Can you get a raise if you're making the minimum wage? Can you be safe when you take a flight overseas? All those things are, you know, those are important to everybody.
One thing that has really come up the last week or so for me, and I'd like you to weigh in on this. Today, when people vote for a candidate, whether it's a mayor, a governor, a senator, a congressman, a president, and I know it's not fair generalization, no generalization is true, including this one, but do they vote more on issues, you know, I'm pro-choice, I'm pro-life? Where does character come in? Do people vote for character and leadership anymore?
I think they do. I mean, I think that character and leadership have become part of another word that I think is a broader word that people really care about, which is authenticity. So there are a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump twice, who at least the second time, and in many cases the first time, said, you know, I don't really care much for the guy's character, but they saw him as authentic, and they saw him as an authentic expression of the way they wanted the president to be. They didn't want an insider, they wanted an outsider. They didn't want someone who would kind of pay attention to the norms of how people treat each other in government. They wanted someone who'd be different. So so character is part of authenticity. I think values is part of authenticity, but authenticity is kind of the expression of who someone is, and I think people want authenticity to have a
Now, you
application,
have
which is
a word for 2021, kind of an effort. I gave it about an hour try, and I got to tell you, I gave up. You have the word grace, your gang of grace. I think it sounds great, but I don't know how to do it. I don't know how, when someone says the election was stolen, when a senator says, it wasn't an armed insurrection, I didn't see arms. I don't know how to answer that with grace. So would you talk about your idea and your initiative of a gang of grace?
Yeah, and gang of grace and presumption of grace as opposed to a presumption of hate. I just, I felt this way since the 90s when I saw so much hatred in politics and in the country more broadly. I think that it's easy to show grace towards someone you agree with. It's hard to show someone you disagree with. And, the things you cited, claiming the election was stolen, nitpicking, saying, well, the Capitol might have been invaded, but, people were looted in Minneapolis. But I would tell you that people who have different politics than you do have the same, mirror image issues. So I was watching some cable news today on my flight, and they were talking about the new vaccine. And they were covering the development of the new vaccine and the Biden administration's role in its distribution like it was a celebration. They weren't saying, well, I wonder if this one works, or how much is Johnson & Johnson making off of this, or did the Biden administration really play a big role here? Now, you think back to last year, how was developments related to the vaccine covered by liberal cable channels? Not like that, not like a celebration. When President Trump said the vaccine could be available by the end of the year, the press didn't say, well, that would be great. Let's write glowing pieces about the people in the Trump administration who developed that. So can you show grace towards the reporters who covered the development of the vaccine last year differently than they're covering it this year? If you're someone on the right, it's hard for them. They look at that and they're furious to say, how unfair. So you have people that you have difficulty showing it to, but I can tell you that people who say the Capitol, the things, the examples you gave, that the election was stolen, they've got problems too with people. So what I'm advocating through the presumption of grace, not the presumption of hate, is I give everybody one or two passes, and a lot of people will use their pass for Donald Trump, people on the left. But I think with few exceptions, it's important to extend some of the presumption of grace. Reason with them, talk to them about their ideas, try to convince them that they're right or that they're wrong if you disagree with them. But just the basics of not hating them, not approaching them in a way that where they're a cartoon or a caricature, even if, the things you just said, I won't say all 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump agree, but let's say 30 million. I think that I feel safe with that number being a floor. You want to disagree with 30 million Americans and not afford them the presumption of grace? I just think as a country, we just can't afford that. So I'm trying to get everybody to start in their political dialogue, in their discussions with friends and family, where some people have trouble extending the presumption of grace. Let's start with a presumption of grace. Let's start by treating people like human beings. Let's start without anger, animus, criticism, and then let's do what we need to do to get the country headed in the right direction. It doesn't cost a single tax dollar, and as I've been able to do it more and more, I'm not perfect, but as I've been able to do it more and more, as I've been trying to practice what I'm preaching now, it feels great. It's a huge relief to not be angry at people and to really just extend the presumption of grace, look at it from their point of view as best you can, and try to engage in a dialogue that can maybe change hearts and minds and brains, as opposed to just constantly clench fists at each other.
I'm going to ask you for a kind of a yes or no answer to this question. Frank Luntz, in one of his polling, said that over 50% think America's best days are behind us. You talk to the Redlands and the Bluelands, yes or no? Would you say that the Redlands and the Bluelands, do they say that our best days are behind us?
Well, increasing number of Americans have said that. I mean, another way to ask the question is, do you think your children and grandchildren will have a better America or more economic opportunity, better country than you've had? And increasing number of Americans have said no. I think that's one of the most corrosive and discouraging statistics and polling, it's kind of a longer term version of, do you think the country's on the right track or the wrong track? People have said wrong track in very high numbers for quite some time, with few exceptions. So I think it's important that this country, which was founded on optimism, which is throughout its history has had lots of optimistic people who have led the way to succeed, as not just economically, but culturally and in terms of society and religion and faith. I think it'd be great to get to a place where people could be more optimistic. But I think, to go back to the presumption of grace, I think part of why people are pessimistic is because they feel so divided. They feel like we're having, the second civil war, not usually violent, but sometimes with violence, but just a day-to-day clash between the red lens and the blue lens that, I could see when people are pessimistic about that. It makes me a little pessimistic, but I'm hoping we can rise above it.
I want to end on something optimistic. Where is the first place you want to get on a plane and go post-COVID? One place.
Back to Tokyo with my family.
Back to Tokyo.
But that's almost always my answer because I love it there.
Thank you to Mark Halperin and our audience for joining us today. If you remember one thing from our discussion, perhaps you will remember to answer your emails, to answer them quickly, and to show grace. I'm Leslie Ungar, your host on Forum 360. Thank you to Mark Halperin and our audience for joining us today.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.